Hi guys, it's Joanne. I'm a painter who uses a robotic arm to create abstract paintings, and today I'm going to talk about this painting that I did this week. And most of the new coating that went into this painting was, let's look at a previous week's painting, was making it larger size. What ended up happening was these are 9 by 12 and this is 11 by 14. And I bought a number of different size panels, wanting to try out painting with the robot and using wood panel. And I ended up running out of the 9 by 12s, and I didn't want to go to the art store just for panels. So if I wanted to do a painting for this week's video, I had to go with the larger panel. It goes this way. I was thinking a lot how I wanted to address this issue, because actually back in January I had a commission to do a number of abstracts like this. This is when I was painting these only by hand. So I used my Python code just to generate the composition, and then I would paint by hand. And when the person commissioning the paintings wanted a different size than I had originally offered them, I actually created new compositions from my code to that new size. And one of the reasons I did that rather than just scale is because the aspect ratio changed and I wanted circles to be circles. So when I was thinking about how did I want to address going up to a bigger size panel, I ended up deciding to write a piece of code that takes this piece, because I have all of the instructions because the robot uses it, or it takes the smaller piece and ends up scaling it up. It scales the center position of each one of the shapes and then scales the actual shape to the average of the aspect ratio. So now I can upscale any of the 9 by 12s and keep all of the shapes with the same ratio. So circles stay circles, but it also scales up. So I can resize things to squares or long pieces or tall pieces. And I didn't have that in the code before. I couldn't do that in the code because whenever I generated a composition, I never created the CSV file of instructions of what shapes are used to make this piece. So I was never able to then scale it. So 11 months ago, when I had that commission come in, I was then generating ideas, but not able to edit them. So for this piece, I was able to take a smaller 9 by 12 and then scale it up, and circles and half circles still stayed circles. What was interesting to me when I then went to paint it was now the shapes are bigger. And so when the robot is painting, the frequency of when the brush goes to get more paint or dip into the paint needed to be increased. So you'll see a couple of the half circles. I think this half circle, when it was first painted, it just kept painting and there was no paint, but I've never painted this large a half circle because you can see the different size half circles. So it was an interesting challenge. The other thing I did with this piece is I put it on newsprint and I just left it. I didn't mount it to anything because you'll remember the foam board that I cut to fit 9 by 12 wouldn't fit an 11 by 14. I was also wanting to try painting around the edges, or continuing the painting around the edges, because when I go to mount these, I want to mount them to a panel. So here's one of the initial ones. So I want to mount this. I'll keep all of these pieces like this for storage, but if I need it for a show or to deliver to a client, I want to mount them to a panel that I can then put the fasteners to hang it on a wall. So my thought is I got the proper glue to glue it down to one of these, and then you can hang it. But I've decided when looking at the different ones that I have, I'll show you a more recent one. So for instance, this one where it has the white edge, what I've noticed is when I put this then mounted into a floating frame, the wood actually reflects the colors of the painting. So I'm playing with what I paint actually on the side because I want to see how it looks framed, and I'm currently putting these into white frames. Anyways, that's a long story to just say that for this piece I tried painting around the edges. I don't think I'll go with painting on by just laying it on newsprint because the newsprint was sticking to this. I might try wax paper or putting some painter's tape down around the edges where it's sitting, just so it's easier to peel off. But this is the painting that came about. What else do I have to tell you about this piece? I always do these videos where I talk a little bit first and then I show you the collaboration with the robot where I'm painting alongside the robot, and you will see at the very beginning I actually lay down a smaller painting, and that was to find the points where the robot will pick the 4 points, and so I centered it there, and then I went and found these 4 points, wrote those, hard-coded those into my Python code, and then sent the robot to the 4 corners. So you'll see me do that twice. And actually, unfortunately, I hadn't clicked record yet, so I missed filming this. But before I put those 4 corners in my code, I just put 1 as a placeholder just to leave a value so my code wouldn't crash. My code didn't crash, but the robot crashed when it read that code because it was actually going to a positive location. And this area where it's painting is actually a negative location, or the coordinates it's going to are negative. It ended up just hitting into itself, but those are always fun to film and watch later on. So this is the painting. Another thing you will notice with this piece is there is a wire hanging out of my robot. Now that came about because I actually tried putting the camera that came with the gripper onto the robot just to see what it would do. And for those of you who want to know, the robot came, or the X-Arm 7 came with an Intel RealSense D435 camera, and I have just left it in the box since I've got this robot because there was already so much to figure out to just code the robot to move around. I didn't go as far as looking at the camera. And what was really exciting about the camera when I played with it and installed it just to see what it would do is that it's actually a 3D camera. While I'm painting this painting, I recorded video from the camera that's mounted to the gripper. Unfortunately, this week just flew by too fast and I haven't figured out how to turn the files that it created into video files that I can then put onto this. So that's on my to-do list for next week. So you won't get to see what the camera actually captured, but I wanted to just have the camera on the robot to see if the wires got in the way. How will I attach the wires? Because the camera did come with zip ties, so I can attach all of that. I'm not so sure I even want the camera on the hand, because if you think about it, when you're painting, your arm is moving around, but your eyes aren't attached to your hand. So it's not really intuitive to think about programming the robot to move and see where it's moving. I have more ideas about putting it on a tripod and then looking at the area, but I haven't gone that far. This week flew by because it's actually December right now when I'm filming this, and so I also, for those that are familiar with my work, before I got into all of this robotic painting, I also paint cityscapes and landscapes. So I was actually shipping quite a few of these prints. So this is of Vancouver on Granville Street. It's a very familiar scene when it's pouring rain in Vancouver and the umbrellas are out and the traffic is out. So that's one of the prints that I do. If you travel around Vancouver, here is Chilliwack Lake. So that's another print. And one of my favorite places in Vancouver is the North Shore Mountains. So this is on Seymour Mountain. And I've done a lot of mountain biking and trail running in there and paint many landscapes of the trees in there. So a lot of my time was spent printing those prints. I print from this studio that I have. I use a Canon printer, and probably the most time consuming part is I buy all my paper at 13 by 19 because that's the maximum size that my printer can take. And then I have to cut every print individually and then I sign it. I package it up into sleeves and then ship those out. So I've sold quite a few of these prints, but I'm still trying to film one of these video logs per week about what I'm up to with the robot. And it's actually been really good because when you code Python weekly, you just get more fluent. It's like learning a language. It is a language, and so when you use it on a weekly basis, it just comes a lot faster. So it was really fun to just write a new piece of code. And going back to that, it is a separate piece of code that I'm now using. So if I have an image that I want to resize, I just take the image and the CSV file that goes with that image, the painting composition, and feed it to this one piece of code that just resizes it. That new size of image can then be fed to the robot and it will then track that area. So I still have to figure out what's the largest area that the robot can do, but at least for now, I'm able to manipulate the size of the canvas and go from there. So now I will go to painting this latest piece and show you how it was done. So my first step is always to mix the paints. I do this by hand by mixing the primaries. I always work with primaries because one idea I have in the long-term future is that the robot will mix its own paints, but for now I do it myself. And here's where I'm taking one of the smaller paintings and putting it in the middle of the panel and going to all 4 corners of the small painting. Now I know that the big panel is almost centered, so I'm programming in those 4 corners into the robot. And now I will restart the code and go again to all 4 corners. Now the robot is in control, and I know that the panel is centered and the robot can reach the entire area of the canvas. And here we go with the painting process. So with this series, I usually have painted everything by hand, but right now I'm getting the robot to lay out the shapes and then I fill in the colors by hand, basically because the robot isn't great at filling in the colors no matter how hard I try, especially those tight edges, and I really like the colors very saturated, so I do that part and I enjoy doing that part, and the robot does the layout. So, and plus it allows me to figure out how this robot is working and still make art. So I spend time drying the paint, whereas as in past paintings where the robot did all of the painting, I had to put a dry interval where I would wait for the paint to air dry. Because I'm doing a larger size painting, the circle is quite large, so it's interesting to see how the paint gets laid out. And because the next shape was the same color, I didn't send the robot to the clean cycle. One thing I haven't mentioned is you do see that white wire attached to the robot, and that is just the connection to the camera that I just left hanging to see how it would work if it's in the way. And that actually works out well because I think it was 2 weeks ago in my video log, I talked about using that green kids block as my mount for the paintbrush, and I didn't want to spend too much time on it because things keep changing, and who knew 2 weeks later I'd be adding a camera, which also could change how the positions are, because right now the camera is facing to the rear of the gripper away from me because the brush is forward. So with my previous brush mount, that actually wouldn't have been an issue. And there you can see with that half circle shape, it wasn't dipping enough paint, so I was actually changing the code to dip more often. But that's okay because then I go and fill in the shape anyways. You'll also notice I changed the green color. One thing that drew me to this particular composition is I love that bright green with all of the pastel colors. And when it first came out with my first attempt at mixing it, it was kind of a grayish green, dark green. So I made it more of a turquoise color for this. So I am using just a piece of cardboard as a straight edge to make sure I get all of the lines straight. And you can also see that I mentioned that I used newsprint for the painting to be on, and so you can see that the paint has gone a little bit over the edges, and that's what I meant where the newsprint is sticking to the painting. And there's another example of the green not filling in because it's not dipping often enough. And just finishing up there. And that's the painting. So that's how the piece was created. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below on the YouTube video that I've created. Otherwise, you can find these videos on my Patreon page and also on my website. I haven't released these paintings for sale yet. Thank you for the people who have inquired about that. As soon as I figure out how I'll be mounting them, I'll photograph them properly and post them somewhere. But for now, I really appreciate you just following along, and it's given me incentive to keep going, and hopefully you're enjoying the process. Often people think when you're automating something, you're actually making it easier, but because you have to know the process in depth of whatever action you're doing and know every detail in order to get a robot to help you out with it, it actually takes a lot more time to figure out. And so it's been a lot of fun to share the process of trying to figure this out. And thanks for watching.